Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter day.
Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Katherine Lippel, professor at the University of Ottawa, the Distinguished Research Chair in Occupational Health and Safety Law. Katherine, welcome to our show today.
Thank you, Steve. Glad to be here.
So, Katherine, we've known each other for a few years or maybe even a few decades, but take us back in our younger days. Tell me how you got involved in this whole area in the first place. I'm assuming you went through law school. Where did you go to school?
I'm from Quebec. I went to L'Université de Montréal and I studied in French. I'm a member of the Quebec Bar. When I was studying, I wasn't specifically studying to become a specialist in workers' compensation law and occupational health and safety. We had 1 week of one class that touched on the Workers' Compensation Act. From there, I did a master's at the same university. And I did a master's based on research I'd been doing as a research assistant for a professor. That professor was interested in interpretation of statutes, which is a fairly arid sort of field. And my job, and I was a kid, right? I was like 22, 21, maybe. My summer job was to read every decision of the Supreme Court of Canada from 1875 to 1980. One at a time, looking for decisions that were interesting in relation to interpretation of statutes. And my boss, I said to him, I'll do this job if you let me gather my own references for things that interest me. And as I was going through 1875 to 1980, but particularly in the first decades, I was reading making note of references of every decision in which a worker was injured, and ended up with really hundreds of judgments of the Supreme Court of Canada over that long period of time, looking at injured workers and what was happening to them. In the beginning, they were suing their employers after, egregious accidents. And as workers' compensation acts began to be adopted across Canada, the debates were different. They were interpretation of workers' compensation law. So I got through those summer jobs with this pile of little file cards, little colored file cards. There were no computers then, right? And saying this might be useful one day. And then when I decided to do a master's after practicing law, I started practicing law in 1978. And I'm a lawyer, right? Although you wouldn't know to look at me, but I am a lawyer. And I started practicing law, and I practiced a little bit in workers' compensation. And then I was always teaching. From the time I was even articling, I was teaching in law school. I was teaching interpretation of statutes. And then I said, well, I think it would be useful to do a master's. And the subject, I had two choices in my brain. The right to heat was my first choice. And the other was workers' compensation law and the rights of workers' compensation claimants. And I couldn't find a supervisor to be in any way interested in welfare, unemployment, poverty, the right to heat. It was just like, that was a no. I couldn't find anybody who would bite on that. But the woman who became my supervisor was a specialist in health law. And of course, the first healthcare systems in Canadian law were workers' compensation systems. So she found an interest in the issues related to the emergence of workers' compensation law, and that therefore she was willing to supervise me. So that's how I got into this. I don't think I've ever told you that. And we go back at least 3 decades, right? But you weren't around in 77, 78, 79 when these things were happening. So that's how I got into it. And then I wrote a thesis, just a master's thesis, but it was long. It was like 350 pages. And it was the history of workers' compensation in Quebec from 1875 to 1980. And I did a parallel analysis of what in English Canada we would call tort law or civil liability. So all the decisions where the workers were suing their employers under the civil code in Quebec. And parallel to that, I analyzed all the decisions applying workers' compensation law. Quebec's first law was 1909. It came into force in 1910. And so starting in therefore the beginning of the 20th century, there were judgments of all, like for my thesis, of course, I didn't just do the Supreme Court. I did the Court of Appeal and Superior Court, looking at all the cases that discussed injured workers. And that was my thesis. And it's still around. It's what do you call it? It's out of print. They used it for years to train the appeal tribunal judges in Quebec. So it was around for a long, long time. But my thesis itself, I finished in 1983. And then in Quebec, we had a major legal reform in 1985. And that's when I decided to publish it. And I did a foreword based on the new legislation, the workers' compensation legislation of 1985, and then putting that into perspective. So there you go. That's how I got into this.
You know, I guess there's a number of things where we really overlap, and I'm a big history buff and have a strong belief that history really helps us shine a light on our current challenges today. So, you know, this is perfect because here I've got, you know, the person that wrote the book about the history of workers' comp in Quebec, which is a bit different than in Ontario, but a lot of similarities. When we look at that history piece, I mean, you wrote the book up to 1980 and then you became part of history. I think it would be safe to say. From that 100 years that you were looking at that history, a lot changed. What are reflections on those changes? We saw move from the private, taking your case to court to a public institution and the changes that happened through there. Any highlights, the good and the bad and the ugly on that?
Staying in the historical perspective, what my thesis found was that there were three periods that were quite different. And the first was from 1875 to 1909, so before any workers' compensation law. And the Quebec judges, not the Supreme Court of Canada judges, but the Quebec judges were very favorable to the workers. And the Privy Council was very favorable to the workers as well. And what my analysis was that in that first period, before the law was adopted, the judges were workers' friends. In the second, when I say that, I mean, clearly it's not, if you have a class analysis, they were not workers' friends as such, but they were filling in the gap of really egregious injustices. The same way, like Bismarck was not really the workers' friend, but we know that Chancellor Bismarck is the father of workers' compensation in Western society, because he was afraid that workers were going to organize into unions, and then we'd end up with the Soviet, well, at that time with communism and socialism, and he was really, really vehement that if you treated workers too badly, it would go bad for capital. It would go badly for capital. So we have to give them the minimum necessary to get them to stop wanting to organize. So that's the context. The first period, very clearly, you know, a lot of the people who were dying were children. They were trying to escape after a 14-hour day, and they'd fall through the windows and the roof, you know, the skylights. So really horrible working conditions also. In the second period, I found, because as I say, I was looking at two parts. I was looking at the civil law and I was looking at the interpretation of the statute. So the civil law, if you measure who's at fault, which is of course the question when you're in civil law, The second period, judges were less likely to find the employer at fault. And for the same type of behavior, they were less exacting of the employer. In the first period, it was the employer better have the best equipment on the market. If not, we're going to find them at fault. In the second period, it was much less stringent. And you got the feeling in reading these judgments, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of pages of dusty books, right? Essentially, what they were saying was the legislature has adopted a law for some workers, because in Quebec at first, it was only a small subcategory of the working population who was covered by workers' comp. And then you got sort of the feeling, well, if they're not covered by the law, it must be because they can look after themselves. We don't have to be paternalistic about this. So in that second period, we started to see sort of less broad interpretation of workers' rights to protection from the employer. And of course, there were fewer kids dying. So that things were improving as well, because we also had prevention legislation. In Quebec, the first act was 1895, and it went all the way up to this day. We have occupational health and safety law, right? But it was starting in the beginning of the century. And in the third period, and the final period, so that was from 1931 to 1980, that was when the Workers' Compensation Board was created in Quebec. Only in 1931 did they have a monopoly. And there was a little period between 28 and 31 where they did a few things. But the big deal was 1931 in Quebec. And then the courts just paid no attention. They were much more, it's not that they were anti-worker or anything like that, but the conversations were much less about the quality of the working conditions. There were no more jury trials, for instance. In the beginning of the century, there were jury trials in damages if a worker was killed or a worker was injured. And by the end of that period in 1980, there was at best statements that social legislation should be interpreted in favor of the worker. That always, and that's still till 2020, that's still true in the courts. But there was very little of what conservative critics would call judicial activism. And I would see judicial activism in the beginning of the century, the 20th century. No, not very much judicial activism have I seen since 1980. I think that's fair to say. At best, you get excellent judgments from the Supreme Court that are just fair, This is not activism. This is just, the emperor has no clothes, and they finally say, hey, how can you interpret the law in this way? This is wrong. But anyway, this is very legalistic, and I don't think that's what you're looking for. But at the same time, that's how things changed. And I think what I should say as well is that parallel to this story that I've just told you, as a lawyer, right from the beginning of my practice, I was in contact with particular injured workers group in Quebec that had a network of lawyers that were supporting them and supporting the workers who were organized by that group. And so from a practical perspective, for years, I've been in contact with injured workers and injured workers groups ever since I started being a lawyer in 1978. So that's a whole other story, but it's kept my attention for almost 50 years, 45 years. So.
Well, when we met, I think it was in 1990, and we were having our first national gathering of injured workers and some of our allies. I think you were then teaching at the University of Quebec at Montreal, and kind of following this relationship building with the injured workers groups in Quebec. I've seen that there was programs at the UQAM, the University of Quebec at Montreal, that were different than what we experienced here, where they really wanted to build links with the community and the academic community. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
I was 25 years a professor at the University of Quebec in Montreal, at UQAM, and they had something, and they still have it, called the Service aux collectivités, so the service for collectivities. There was a stream that was with unions, there was a stream that was with the environmentalists, and a stream with women's groups. And the idea was that, and this is from the outset, UQAM was a progressive university when it was created in the 70s. And the idea was that it was predicated on the importance of university knowledge being shared with the communities within which the university is rooted. And in the collective agreement, we were unionized, of course. It was provided that the work that was done in partnership with the community, if it was filtered through the Service aux collectivités, this organization within the university, you could get credit. You could, instead of teaching a course, you could be doing a training session with a union. And my first work in that context, and I'm just thinking back, I think it was the CSN who came to see me. The CSN is one of the big trade unions in Quebec, saying, would you put together some documentation for training union reps who represent injured workers? And that's how both the CSN, the FTQ, the Quebec Federation of Labor, and at the time it was the CEQ, it's now the CSQ, which is the teachers union. There was a protocol with those three unions where they could define their needs, and we as professors could apply to say, okay, we can fill this need. And often it was co-constructed, right? Where it was saying, well, I know about this. If this is of interest to you, I could give training on this, and vice versa. And I was at UQAM from 1982 until 2006. And many, many, many years of research were done in partnership with the unions through the Service aux collectivités. Parallel to that, both the French, well, not the French, the Quebec funding agency, at the time it was the Conseil québécois de recherche sociale, and the National Funding Agency, which is SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, they both encouraged research in partnership with the community. And my first decades of research and partnership, which is now we're talking about funded research. So we're not talking about getting 3 credits for writing a training manual. We're talking about research, right? And you know this well because you and I worked together in RACWI, which was, of course, funded by SSHRC. But long before that, my first, I think it was in 1990, don't want to get that wrong, or 91 or 92, with Karen Messing, we had L'Invisible qui fait mal, which was a research partnership on women's occupational health and safety, in partnership with the FTQ, the CSN, and the CSQ. And we worked from 1992 to 2009, funded by this Quebec funding agency, and well funded, hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 17-year period, to do research, multidisciplinary research. Karen's an ergonomist, and we had sociologists, and we had social workers, and I'm a lawyer, as you know. And we did research on issues that were of importance both to the women's committees of those 3 trade unions and to the health and safety committees. And the idea was to get the unions themselves to get together between the women's committees and the health and safety committees to define their needs, because often, I don't know if in Ontario it's the same thing, but often within a union, there are silos, and there's the women's committee silo, and there's the health and safety committee silo. And in Quebec, that was certainly the case. And our partners physically sitting around our table were drawn from both the health and safety specializations within the unions and the workers, including workers' comp, and the women's groups within the unions. And they defined our agendas. And so that 1992, the first one, we were working on mental health at work when nobody was working on compensation for stress. And that was defined as a priority. We were working on musculoskeletal disorders. We were working on rehabilitation and the rights of women in the context of rehabilitation, in particular, women workers. We were working on violence in the workplace. And those are some of the, we did this for 17 years, so we have quite a lot to go on about. But that partnership, I think in hindsight, when you look at UQAM and the fact that they valued work with the community as an employer, that gave us talents and abilities to apply for these very competitive grants because we had partners and we knew how to work with partners. And of course, since then, I've been working with partners. I've been at the University of Ottawa since 2006. Before that, I had a big partnership grant with the network of people with disabilities in Quebec and the network of injured workers groups all around the table, trying to say, how can we speak with one voice? Is there any relevance in speaking for one voice? Because as you well know, it's not necessarily the case that people with disabilities and their groups will be on the same picket lines with injured workers. And they will not necessarily be articulating the same policy priorities, the same suffering. What they're suffering from can be very different depending on which groups you're talking to. So from 2001 to 2004, I had this grant funded by SSHRC to try to get communities to talk to each other through the research process.
So, you've got those 17 years working on occupational health and safety with workers. As an advocate, our audience knows I'm an advocate for injured and disabled workers. We've worked with researchers to document, to provide the evidence that we can use to try to make the system better going forward. From your years of experience, what are some of those opportunities for improving the systems, both in occupational health and safety, which is the prevention part, and then in workers' compensation, which is after the prevention failed? Where can we go to improve those situations for workers, both in Quebec and Ontario?
Well, I'll start with compensation because I think the conversation about occupational health and safety is a separate one. And I think the first place I would go is to look to all the mechanisms that promote stigma of claimants. And I think that is, if life is short, if I have one thing to pick, stop treating people like criminals, because that is by far the most devastating part of these systems. And we've gone a long way in relation to that, at least in terms of lip service. I'm not sure we've done as well in terms of on the ground practices of employers, depending on the provinces. So that's one thing. We're in the midst of a reform of our law. I told you that in 1985, I was working on the reform. It hasn't been changed since. I'm very concerned with what's happening in Quebec right now because it's being sold as modernization. And what I'm seeing is not something that is moving us forward. I won't get into the details of that because I don't think that's necessarily of interest to your audience because it's quite specific. But what I can say is that what makes Quebec's current system good, better than the Ontario system, there's quite a lot of things. There's, first of all, there's the question of an independent appeal tribunal. And Quebec, of all the workers' compensation systems in Canada, Quebec has had the most independent tribunal during my lifetime. In all the studies that I've done, since the 70s, there has been an independent appeal tribunal. It's a very conservative When I say conservative, I guess that means something different in Ontario, but these are not radicals sitting and rewriting the law. These are, very sort of staid decision makers, very respectable decision makers. But what's important is that they are independent. They are not bound by board policy, and they are in a position where they read the law, interpret the law, and apply the law. And they have been since the existence of appeals in 1977, I think, 75 or 77, I can't remember when they were actually started, but it's been a while, okay? And we've gone through, this is our fourth appeal tribunal, because every now and then employers will get frustrated with the decisions and they say, we don't like this tribunal, we want another one. And then, of course, the next tribunal is still independent. And as long as it's independent, they're going to apply the law. And sometimes that costs money, right? And so what's happened up until now is, even though, I'll give you an example. We have scheduled diseases in our workers' compensation law. The compensation board has the power to add new diseases as science discovers new things, right? By regulation. The law dates back to 85. The only disease they ever added was warts for poultry processors. They have never added many, silicosis in relation to lung cancer, for instance. I won't get into the technical details, but they've never updated that list.
Katherine, we're running out of time. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
We're down to our last few seconds here. I got a million questions to ask, but maybe, in the new year, we'll get you back again. But now, how can people find out more information about your work going forward?
I have a website. All the publications, at least the references to all the publications, are on the website. I'm sure you can share the address. And
we'll do that.
I can be contacted through the website as well. And we have a research partnership that has its own website within my website on return to work. And people interested in return to work in particular can also look at that. Lots of videos. And we're always looking to hear people's stories if people want to tell us more about their experiences.
Katherine, once again, thank you so much for joining us today. I loved it. I could talk to you for hours. For our viewers, this will be kind of the last show for 2020. We're always look forward to any of your feedback and suggestions. You can catch us on Facebook at Community Conversations. I want to ask everybody to stay safe and all the best for the new year coming up. Thanks again, Katherine.
Thanks to you, Steve.
Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter day.